This morning, we get to talk about the theological concept of inability. This concept helps us distinguish between two terms. The first is free agency, and the second is free will. Now, that first one, free agency, may not sound familiar. The second one probably does, free will. See, often when people talk about free will, they lump it together, not knowing that for almost millennia, theologians have made a real distinction about what free will means. And I want to tell you about that today. First, let's talk about free agency. Free agency simply means that part of what it means to be human is to have the ability to make real, consequential, voluntary decisions that lean us towards things that are right and things that are wrong. We have the freedom to choose that. And because of that, we are morally responsible to God for the free, consequential, voluntary decisions we make. Now, free will is different. Way back when, Augustine was in a debate with a man named Pelagius, and they argued about what was it like, what was possible for a person outside of the grace of God. Pelagius said that the person outside the grace of God could be inclined Godward and eventually choose God. Now, that's not what Augustine thought, and that's not what we think. We agree with Augustine, who said, outside the grace of God, no one can lean or be oriented Godward. Packer summarizes like this. He says, we have no natural ability to discern and choose God's way because we have no natural inclination Godward. Our hearts are in bondage to sin, and only the grace of regeneration can free us from that slavery. He said we have no natural ability in us. It always comes from God. He goes on to use this line that I think is so helpful to know what he's talking about. He says, only the freed will freely and heartily chooses righteousness. Your will needs to be freed up by God to be able to freely choose righteousness. He gets that concept from the book of Romans, chapter 6, and I want to read you a few verses. You'll hear exactly what I just described to you in the words of Packer. We see this, Romans chapter 6, verse 17. But thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you have come to obey from your heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. He goes on to say in verse 20, when you were slaves to sin, you were free from the control of righteousness. And now in verse 22, but now that you have been set free from sin and become slaves of God, the benefit you reap leads to holiness. The result is eternal life. So this is an incredible teaching, and it can feel like a real bummer to hear the reality of outside the grace of outside the grace of God, we can't be oriented Godward. But this is an incredibly beautiful teaching about what God really does to save sinners. It always helps, I think, to put in perspective, to know what you are saved from. And this is it. Without God's intervention, we can't know God. And to sum up, actually, Packer goes in a direction that I think is also really helpful. At the end of this little section he has on inability, he talks about the will as kind of this abstraction. And he personalizes at the end of the chapter, and I want to leave you with this. He writes this. He says, the truth about free agency and about Christ's freeing sin's slave from sin's dominion can be expressed more clearly if the word will is dropped and each person says, I am the morally responsible free agent. I am the slave of sin whom Christ must liberate. I am the fallen being who only have it in me to choose against God till God renews my heart. The beautiful news about our inability is that God in his grace, when he calls you, saves you from it.